everybody's angry. We have to adhere to this principle of the rule of law.
Good evening and welcome to Crosstalk. I'm Francine Rafton. Drug abuse and use have affected countless lives in this country, but what should be blamed? The drugs themselves or the laws forbidding their use? We'll examine the issue of re-legalization of drugs tonight on Crosstalk. Let's meet our panelists. Dr. Donald Trunke is with us. Dr. Trunke is the professor and chairman of the Department of Surgery at Oregon Health Sciences University. Dennis Donen is the Director of Development for CODA, Treatment, Recovery, and Prevention. Richard Burke is with us. Richard is the former state party chair of the Libertarian Party of Oregon. And our regular panelist, Jim Greenfield, is on board as well. The re-legalization of drugs tonight. Well, the government's war on drugs, is it working, or does the prohibition of drugs create more victims than the drugs themselves?
It's clearly failing, Francine. You know, there are drugs everywhere. Our kids can get them. They're in city halls. They're in prisons. There's crime all around them. The federal government, you know, they make a lot of arrests. They seize a lot of drugs. But have they stopped the drug war? Absolutely not. It is a complete failure.
I agree. I don't believe the drug war is working. If you look at the billions of dollars that we spend on the drug war, 2/3 is going to interdict supply, and we haven't stopped the supply. The other 1/3 goes to treat the demand, and quite frankly, I don't think we're doing a very good job there. We're creating a foreign policy disaster in some of these third world countries. Look what we've done to Colombia. Look what we've done to Peru. We've created a drug cartel, mafia-type organizations that actually makes these governments really bad.
Before we write this off as a total failure, take a look at some of the things that have happened. Of course, being in the treatment field, we are most well known for our failures rather than our successes. For 7 consecutive years, we had reduced drug use by young people. This is self-report, both 8th and 12th grade. We also saw a reduction in the number of drug-addicted babies that are born in this county was reduced by about 62% over the past 5 years. So some good things have happened. I think writing it off as a total failure across the board, not correct.
Well, you know, I would say we don't really even have a war against drugs. We kind of have a war of rhetoric against drugs. Maybe we could call it a skirmish. The fact of the matter is that if you want to have a war against drugs, you've got to hit hard, which means you've got to not just go after the supply, you've got to go after the demand. And what that means is you've got to start putting people in prison for possession. And we're not doing that. You know, no matter how many times you get caught with possession of small amounts of drugs, you get a slap on the wrist, you get a fine, maybe a diversion program. You don't go to prison.
What do you?
So you know, if you want to win the war on drugs, you've got to fight it like a war. You've got to go back to the strict laws that we had back in the 1950s, where we didn't have a massive drug problem because people who were in possession of drugs, they went to jail.
What you're going to have to do, though, is you're going to have to declare martial law. You know, we are a free society. And I think that what we have seen is that you cannot stop drugs in a free society through laws. I mean, look what's happening already. Civil forfeiture laws are taking hold because the standard legal system isn't working. Search and seizure laws are being weakened. Random checkpoints. A lot of civil liberties are, you know, you cannot take drugs out of a free society. So the only way to do it is to make the society unfree. You know, we could shoot drug users like they do in China, but do we want to live in the kind of society that China has?
And some of the information that I've read as well contradicts what you are just saying about going to jail for possession or for the use of soft drugs. In fact, 1 in 5 in the federal system right now are drug-related offenses.
Well, at the federal level, they've started to get tough on drug dealers, where they get 5-year prison sentences for drug dealing.
Now we're talking life sentences and death penalties for marijuana possession.
No, it's 5 to 10 years. It's not for possession. It's only for dealing in the federal system. And under Oregon state law, you don't go to prison for possession of any drug.
Well, Oregon is the most lenient state in the nation.
You don't go to jail for possession. Now, Richard, you say, well, if we live in a free society, you can't do that in a free society. Living in a free society doesn't mean that nothing is against the law.
I'm not saying that.
If you rob a bank in a free society, you go to prison.
Well, I'm not saying that
now,
either.
I'm not advocating these seizure laws. I'm not advocating violating people's civil liberties. But, you know, we used to have more freedom in this country 30 or 40 years ago, and our drug laws were a lot tougher.
We had more freedom in certain ways. For example, taxes were lower. There were a lot of areas like that. We had more property rights, you know, but we were less free in what we're talking about today, in my view.
Yeah, less free to take drugs.
Okay, but what you're doing is you're comparing apples and oranges. You know, you cannot say that because I believe in a free society we cannot keep drugs out, that I also believe we should be allowed to rob banks. You know, that's ridiculous. Of course we shouldn't be allowed to do those kinds of things.
If we can take a look at an associated issue here. For the last 25 years we have been fighting a war against smoking. And it's been terribly successful. As a matter of fact, smokers are the lepers of the 90s. You see them standing out in front of most buildings because they're not allowed inside. We know what the dangers are. And now we have more ex-smokers than we have smokers. The addictive potential, and I think Dr. Trunke would agree, for nicotine is extremely high. As a matter of fact, as high as some compare it to heroin. But still, in 25 years, we've been able to reduce the number down from a high of about 52% of the adult population that smoked to less than 26% now.
And you did it without outlawing cigarettes.
No, but we did, is we made smoking so far outside the norm that even smokers, I'm an ex-smoker.
Well, look what's happened.
What I'm trying to say here is that if we put as much attention to fighting drug use as we have in fighting cigarette smoking, we will be successful, but we have to give it 2 generations.
But Dennis, then why not make drugs, all drugs, the same? Alcohol, tobacco, hard drugs, soft drugs, whatever you want, make it the same. Decriminalize it. We don't put cigarette smokers in jail. We treat them. We encourage them. We educate them not to smoke. And you're right. We still have 400,000 deaths a year from smoking. We have 100,000 deaths a year from alcohol, and we only have 20,000 from hard drugs.
You know, you're right
I'm
about something, though.
I'm not saying that we shouldn't address all of them. We should put them all in the same camp. And you can't put somebody in jail for the possession of tobacco.
We don't advocate drug use. We think it's bad. And I think I can find some agreement with you in how we fight these things. I think we should fight drug use, if it were legal, in some of the same ways that we fight smoking, through social mechanisms rather than legal mechanisms. I'm right on with you on that one. I agree.
Well, look, first of all, you say we can't do this in a free society. The only freedom I'm advocating taking away is the freedom to destroy your nervous system and your brain by taking drugs. You can't have a free society where people have destroyed their capacity to function effectively and to think logically, which is what drugs do to people. Secondly, you say, well, we have more deaths from legal drugs like alcohol and cigarettes than we do from illegal drugs. Well, that's an argument against legalization, because if you legalize these other drugs, then the use will increase and you'll have more deaths from those. So the fact that, you know, you say, well, gee, we don't make cigarettes illegal. We've got 50 million Americans still smoke. Do we want 50 million Americans using cocaine?
See,
I don't think so.
You're wrong about something, Jim. That argument presupposes that those who want drugs cannot get them now. The argument presupposes that if we legalize drugs, people will all of a sudden be able to get them. If I want to get some drugs, all I have to do is go to my local high school and get them. I think anyone who knows anything about drugs knows that it's very easy to obtain. I argue that use would not go up dramatically because anyone who wants it can get it today. They can get it within a couple of hours.
Why can't the police?
I'm sure they can.
But Dennis is absolutely right. The use of drugs among high schoolers has gone down. The only thing that hasn't changed is those hardcore drug users. That number has stayed exactly the same. I don't think that that's going to increase one iota if you decriminalize drugs. The evidence in Europe is just the opposite. In Europe, they approach this, you can't stop people from using drugs, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, or hard drugs. You can't stop it. Let's control it, though. Let's get them into treatment programs. Let's use education programs. Regulation, precisely.
There's one bottom line issue, okay, and I'd like to ask the audience out there to consider this point. Whether we like it or not, and I don't think any of us do, drugs are there. Drugs are making lots and lots of money. Now, we can ask ourselves this question. Do we want this industry to be in the hands of society, where it can be handled and managed, or do we want it continue to allow it to be
taxed?
Well, do we want it or do we want it to continue to be in the hands of killers and social predators?
The problem with that argument that I see is that what you're basically saying is that it's not the drug problem itself, it's largely that people are profiting from it. That's an element that I'm hearing. I think the concern is that right now we don't do a good job of controlling alcohol and tobacco, particularly for young people, and if that's the major concern here is young people. You got 90% of 12th graders have had alcohol, and somewhere over 60% have had access to illegal drugs as well. When you say these drugs, if they became legalized, and I'm assuming for adults here, we're assuming we're not going to have a 15-year-old or 14-year-old, 12-year-old go into a pharmacy somewhere and ask for a gram of cocaine.
You wouldn't advocate use for minors?
I would advocate that a 14 or 15-year-old should be in a treatment program.
That's another issue I'd like to address, because there's not adequate funding for treatment. I've been in the business for 10 years, and the state spends about $14 million totally for their treatment programs. Over 50,000 people receive services. For $14 million, you can't even run a small hospital. There's not adequate funding from United Way. Less than 1% of their funds go for alcohol and drug treatment and prevention. The funding isn't there. The other thing is that people who become addicted don't rush down to get into treatment. Again, I want to go back to the issue about the children. By saying that when you're an adult, you can get access to these substances, they're not going to hear that. They're going to say, these are okay. That's what they're going to hear you say.
As far as the treatment goes, I would say that we would fund it by diverting some of the funds we're using for law enforcement.
A lot of people who would otherwise take drugs, would otherwise buy drugs, won't do it because it's illegal. And if you made it really illegal, I mean, if somebody knew that if they were caught in possession of marijuana or cocaine or heroin, that they were going to go to jail for 5 years, 90% of the people doing it wouldn't do it. The word would get out real fast. Most people start taking drugs when they're teenagers. And if the word starts getting out, your buddy, he got caught and he's in jail now, you're not going to do it.
Well, I'd say two things.
You're going to stop it cold. And that worked. People always say prohibition didn't work with alcohol. Well, prohibition did work. It reduced alcohol consumption by 50%.
Okay, you've hit on a real important point. If we have legal drugs, we will have certain problems, but we'll get rid of a lot of the problems that drug prohibition causes today. If we keep drugs illegal, we're not going to have these problems, but we're going to still have the problems that we have over here, drug trafficking in the streets and so on and so forth. The question isn't which one of us is going to have utopia. Neither of our approaches is going to have utopia. The question is, which set of problems can society manage best? And I would argue that those problems are those where you don't have it under the carpet, you don't have it in the black market, you don't have it in the underworld. If it's in the open, society can cope with it much better.
There's also, the assumption that since they will be available through legal channels, there will be no black market. Not correct. Unless, of course, the quality and price are adequate, particularly the quality, to compete with what's provided through the state, if that's your vision.
That's not the case with alcohol or cigarettes. You don't have a huge black market for, you might have someone making elderberry wine in their basement.
Yeah, for teenagers, you do. Teenagers, so it's illegal for them to take alcohol, it's illegal for them to use tobacco, they do it anyway, that's a black market.
No, he's talking about regulating the quality, doing all these other things, and you're dealing with a separate issue. We have legal and controlled alcohol and cigarettes, and we do not have a large black market for alcohol and cigarettes.
Well, I'm saying that when you have teenagers using the products illegally, that is a black market.
Well, it's a black market, but it's not manufacturing of unsafe products,
but Jim,
and therefore putting it on the black market.
In Europe, I mean, Europe has approached this entirely differently than we have. The Frankfurt Resolution has brought in a number of cities, and they're experimenting. It's not a perfect system. They've had some problems. They had some problems in Zurich. They've had some problems in Amsterdam. But their attitude is totally different towards drugs. They have decriminalized it. You don't go to jail for possession of a small amount of drugs. You go to jail if you have a large amount of drugs because by definition you're a dealer, and they don't want dealers. They regulate it. And they get people into treatment programs. In Amsterdam, the use of hard drugs has fallen, not gone up, it has fallen. And yes, you're never going to get everybody off drugs. It's impossible. But you can get them into treatment programs. And if they do antisocial acts, then you go to jail.
Well, you know, you cite Amsterdam. They never had the level of problem that we've had in this country with drug abuse. And I can cite you another alternative, which is this country 40 years ago, where we didn't have any significant drug problem because we had real tough, hard laws. You got caught, you're in jail. And if we went back to that, we wouldn't have a problem.
I don't agree with you. I think that the reason we have such a problem with drugs now is because of the money that's involved in selling the drugs, the money that goes to other countries, the money that supports the crime, organized crime.
And the criminals.
If you want to pay for a habit, if you want to pay for a habit in the United States, you either push, prostitute, pimp, or steal. All of those are antisocial.
The reason we have a problem now is because we effectively decriminalized drug abuse in the 60s and the 70s. And if you talk about money, if you legalize drugs, it's going to be more money. You're going to have large corporations going to be selling drugs in pharmacies or in corner stores, and anybody's going to be able to go in and buy them, and you're going to see the use of drugs double, triple, quadrupling, and then you're going to have millions of Americans walking around brain dead and voting.
You're going to have a distinct subculture for one. The thing that
it's
I think
already there. It's already there. It's not inherent.
Let's talk about the crime component here. You're saying that if we decriminalize, we'll have less acquisitive crime, less people out there committing the crime to get the money to do the drugs. We tend to ignore that there are a number of crimes committed because people are on drugs when they commit those crimes. Mm-hmm. That's one of the oddities of this industry, that the causes of drug abuse can also be the results.
And there are laws.
Let me finish.
Okay.
And I don't have to go too far. I remember, if we ever remember someone named Donna Schunkweiler, who was a woman who was driving in Beaverton. She jumped a curb, lost control of her car, killed 2 young boys, maimed a third, had a whole series of drugs in her system. The one that strikes me were the 2 train accidents that were caused back east. This one really set me off. Some employees on a Amtrak, I'm assuming it was Amtrak, decided it would be a good idea to go get stoned. As a result, 17 people died. So you may reduce the acquisitive crime, but those crimes that are committed on the drugs, including the man who was out assaulting developmentally delayed women at knife point, because he was taking, I think he was taking methamphetamine. And of course, at the end of his career, he gave the knife to the woman and said, "Kill me," which didn't happen. But again, you're going to maybe reduce the acquisitive crime, but those crimes committed on the drugs themselves, those will increase. And I go back to this issue about cigarettes. We're talking, I also want to just briefly address some of the medical issues as well. Dr. Trunke, I know you see a lot of drug and alcohol problems up at OHSU. One of the things we discovered recently is that those who take methamphetamine, the physiological and neurological damage that is caused by that drug is not reversible. So we are creating a whole new medical component that we'll have to deal with if these drugs become legal. We know that cocaine is bad for your heart and your blood pressure, heroin, you know, you'll have access to diseases like hepatitis and AIDS, septicemia, all these things. We will see increases in those medical disorders because we'll allow those drugs greater access.
But Dennis, look, I mean, let's use cigarettes. We tell the American public, you're going to get cancer, you're going to get cancer of the lung, you're going to get cancer of the bladder, there's maybe an increased incidence in cancer of the pancreas. The American public pays attention, and they try to get off cigarettes. It is very psychologically and physiologically addicting, though, but many of them get off. You tell people that they're going to ruin their brain if they take cocaine or methamphetamine, they're not going to do it. The great majority will not do it, and they will not increase usage.
Why wouldn't they respond to education the same way?
Partly, we want a short-term fix for a long-term, complex problem. You know, we want to be able to just shut this thing off. It's going to take 2 generations. That's at least something that I've learned from our executive directors who've been in this business over 20 years.
See, that's a dangerous political argument, though. I mean, if you say, it's kind of like if you say that if you're one of those who believes that the welfare state has failed, you know, you can always say, well, it's because we're not doing enough money. We don't have it structured right. It's going to take 20 years for the results to be felt. I mean, I think that this problem is so severe that we have to have better answers than that. We have to not I mean,
pass the buck.
anything can happen in 20 years. And you know, and I'd like to come back to one of the things you said. You said that if we legalize drugs, we might not have so many of the crimes relating to drug turf, but we might have more incidental crimes of people driving. You had different terms for them. I don't recall what they are.
Yeah.
Okay, but again, that comes back to my basic point that it's not a choice of whether or not we'll have problems. It's a choice of which problems we as a society wants to face. And I would argue that if we no longer have Bloods and Crips fighting for turf in our inner cities, but we maybe do have a few more of these incidental crimes, then the tools that you have advocated so well have a better shot at reaching these people, because these people are not hardened criminals fighting for turf in our inner cities.
One thing I will say is that when you try to fight a war, you mobilize all you have, right? And one of the things that Dr. Trunke mentioned was there's an imbalance between the amount that's invested in interdiction, when 10 to 20% of the drugs are shut off before they get inside the borders. But you have a table that's uneven. You have legs that are shorter than others. When those legs are equal, when you have money for treatment, education, prevention, then I think you've got a chance. I think you've got a much better chance when the table is level.
Well, let's get some more dollars then to do these treatment and prevention programs. Are we going to continue to spend dollars on building more and more jails? It's sad that in Oregon we're building more jails than we are schools.
It is.
That's crazy. I can't.
Murderers and rapists go free so that marijuana users can have a spot in the jail.
Another larger issue, too. One of the battles that I could never understand is possession is illegal, but use is not. That's more than just a semantic dance. As far as I'm concerned, if we invested more in treatment, we might well have less people in prison. It's half the cost. It's 5 times more effective.
But Dennis, we do not have a rational, coherent drug policy in the United States. The federal government subsidizes tobacco. The liquor lobby is absolutely incredible how they've been able to keep the liquor taxes down. Why? Why are we being held hostage by these lobby groups?
Well, there's another point, too.
It's just crazy.
And not just at the federal level, too, Doctor. Happens right here, too. We try to institute a nickel increase on the cost of a 6-pack or a bottle of wine. Flattened. It just never passed. It was the first time since 1971 that they wanted to raise.
Well, that's what's going to happen. If you legalize drugs, you're going to have large corporations selling drugs, and you're going to have exactly the same problem.
Yeah, but Jim, I think we're focusing too much on the semantics here.
What about advertising?
But you're focusing on legalization. I would rather decriminalize it. I would rather regulate it. I think you and I might share some common ground here, but one that I don't share with you is to completely legalize it. That's crazy. You have to control it. You have to have people get an education. You have to have people in treatment programs.
If you haven't decriminalized it, what do you do with people who are selling it?
Pushing is an offshoot only because they make money to pay for their own habit, or they're just making money, period.
If it's not illegal, and I open up a store and I say, here I got my heroin, my cocaine, my marijuana, LSD, methamphetamine, it's all in my store, come in and buy it. What are you going to do? It's now legal. So how are you going to stop me from doing that?
But it was legal in the United States in the 1800s.
Okay, I've got a store, I can do it legally. I can advertise in the newspaper, I can advertise in magazines, I can advertise on the radio for it. What are you going to do to me?
But the federal government regulates advertisement of alcohol and tobacco right now. Why would they not regulate the advertising of hard drugs?
I forget, when heroin could be bought over the counter, according to Scientific American, the largest group of drug addicts that existed were middle-aged white women. It did not go into the underworld until the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1904, when it started with the Asian community in San Francisco and spread out, and as more and more drugs were made illegal, the underworld spread through the country and proliferated, and now, you know, I believe that the underworld has an upper hand over our law enforcement.
You're not responding to my argument, though. What you're going to have, if you legalize it, you're going to have companies traded on the New York Stock Exchange selling drugs. You're going to have them advertising. You're going to have it socially acceptable, morally acceptable.
Hey, gambling
Anybody can
funds
walk into any
now.
store and buy
The lottery funds.
I don't.
Is that the kind of society we want to live in?
Well, we don't want to live in a drug-dominated society. None of us want that, Jim. Okay, but again, if it's in society, yes, some of those things will happen, and that will be a problem, and we'll have to deal with it. But we're going to eliminate all of these other problems that we've seen we cannot address. And another point I want to raise is this. Who owns you? And again, I'd like to appeal to the audience out there. Who owns you? Do you think it would be right if the government said, you have an obligation to your wife and kids, and mountain climbing is too dangerous, and surfing is too dangerous. If you get killed, you won't be able to support them. Therefore, there should be a law against you doing that activity. Saying that an individual doesn't have control over what they do is saying that you do not own yourself, that society owns you. And I don't believe that that's the kind of society the United States is.
Well, you know what?
We only have a few minutes left, and I do want to just touch on the issue of using marijuana for medicinal purposes, and talk a bit about, would you even support even a little bit if in fact that was something that, and it has been shown in many studies to be very effective in chemotherapy symptoms and side effects, as well as an appetite stimulant for AIDS patients.
Any drug, if it's a prescribed drug, it's prescribed by a physician for medicinal purposes, sure, I'm not going to complain about that. But as far as a question of individual liberty, yeah, I'm troubled by the idea of any law that infringes on people's individual liberty to do something that only harms themselves and doesn't harm other people. The problem is that you can't really draw that line, because certain types of activity you do that harm yourself inevitably harm other people also. And using drugs, which destroys the capacity of your brain to function the way it was designed to function, means that you're going to be harming everybody you interact with. And if you happen to be a woman and you're pregnant, you're going to be harming your own child.
So
and if you're a parent and you're trying to parent...
Secondhand smoke harms people all the time, Jim.
Yeah, but if you're a parent and you're on drugs, that's the reason that we're having the epidemic of child abuse that we've been having.
So your bottom line is that when
it's directly
no more than alcohol.
Yep. It's directly connected to drug abuse.
So in the bottom,
but tobacco and alcohol are just as big a problem as hard drugs and the things that you're talking about.
Yes, your
bottom line
I'll tell you
is
what,
that
if
when
some guy wants to go out,
now linked to SIDS, for heaven's
sake.
sake.
If some guy wants to go out by himself and shoot up heroin in the Mojave Desert, I don't care. But if he's going to be my next door neighbor, I do care, because it's going to affect me. It's people who are opposed to drug legalization aren't just trying to control other people's lives because of some moral principles. It's because it affects us, and we've seen the effects. It's totally damaging to everyone in society when you have a lot of people using these kinds of substances.
So your bottom line is that when push comes to shove, society does own the individual.
No, I didn't say that.
That's what you're saying.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
You're saying that if an individual engages in behavior that society doesn't think is appropriate, even if it doesn't directly harm other people, that society has a right to regulate that person to prevent...
Look, we have nuisance laws. If you're my next door neighbor and you start using toxic substances on your property, and the fumes are coming over to my property, you're interfering with my freedom, and I have a right to say something about it. This is the same principle. If you're taking drugs and you're driving on the roads with me, or you're interacting with my kids, or you're a teacher in the school and you're taking care of my kids, and your mind has been destroyed by drugs, I got something to say about it.
I don't favor those
And now
things.
I need to exercise my right to thank the panelists here today. Dr. Donald Trunke, Professor and Chairman, Department of Surgery, Oregon Health Sciences University. Dennis Donan, Director of Development, CODA, Treatment, Recovery, Prevention. Richard Burke, former State Party Chair, Libertarian Party of Oregon. And Jim Greenfield, our regular panelist. I'm Francine Rafton. Join us next week for Divorce, Fair to Both Men and Women. Good night.
Words are good, but action counts. Cascade Policy Institute rewards Oregonians who have good ideas to make government better and smaller. Schools? Bypass bureaucracy and allow them to compete. Healthcare? Allow individual choice and responsibility. Bigger government? There are better common sense alternatives for Oregon. Be part of the solution. Call Cascade Policy Institute